All right, welcome back to Doctrines 3, the Doctrines of Angels, Church, and End Times, as we continue our study in Ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, or how should the church be governed. We're talking about now the Presbyterian form of church government, or governed by the elders. The name Presbyterian comes from, again, that Greek word presbyteros. We talked about this last week when we talked about our the different church leaders. That presbyteros meaning elder, or one who has come before. It suggests the dignity, maturity, and age of those church leaders. But now, as we get into the form of church government, we need to talk about how this applies. Presbyterian, sometimes termed federal form of church government, and then we use the term Presbyterian to talk a little bit more about the denomination itself. And so, in order to kind of differentiate between Presbyterian denomination and the federal church government formation, or what I just call the Presbyterian form of church government, it designates a church that's governed by the elders, as in Presbyterian and other Reformed churches. In contrast to the congregational form of church government, which we'll talk about in the next video, the Presbyterian form emphasizes representative rule by the elders, who are appointed or elected by the people, or perhaps by each other, depending on your type of Presbyterian church government. Basically, over every church, there's a council or board of elders that preside over the church, and that board of elders then either sits above the pastor, or the pastor himself sits on that board of elders. And then it gets a little bit more complicated than that, but we'll talk about that in a second. The name Presbyterian, the session then, which is made up of elected ruling elders, the teaching elder then presiding over it, governs the local church. So you have a session, or like I said, a board, or perhaps a council, depending on however you want to name that. Presbyterian Church itself calls it the session. And again, that's just simply a board of ruling elders over the church. Okay, above the session then, within Presbyterian, the Presbyterian Church, is the presbytery, which then presides over a group of churches, including all ordained ministers or teaching elders, as well as one ruling elder from each local congregation in a district. So then there's let's say a pastor from each church, but then there's also a member at large from each church that then goes to the presbytery, which is, again, a larger group that presides over a number of churches in a region. Above the presbytery then is the synod, and over the synod then is the General Assembly, which is the highest court in the Presbyterian Church. Both of these bodies are also equally divided between ministers and laymen, or ruling elders. So you basically have a kind of a bicameral system then, much like the United States government, how we have the House of Representatives, which represent the people, and the senators, which represent the states themselves. So you have the pastors, or ministers, ordained ministers, and then a group of laymen who represent the people themselves within the General Assembly. And then a pastor within there usually serves as one of the elders in that session. Here's a little chart here to help you understand that over every congregation then elects. You see the dotted line that goes around there has some kind of check and balance against who should be elders. Those elders make up the session. Remember, those elders are made up of both laymen, lay people, or people from the congregation at large, and paid pastoral staff are members of that elder the session, and then they send one person, two people to the presbytery, one elder or member at large, and then an ordained pastor, perhaps a senior pastor, would then represent that church in the presbytery. Then within the presbytery, they then select out of the presbytery who should then go and represent that larger region with the General Assembly, which is usually a national body. The biblical support for this, where they come up with this, is that in every mention, or not every mention, but most of the mentions of the word elder, is that it's plural. There's elders in Jerusalem. There's elders in Ephesus. And in Jerusalem, in both Acts chapter 11 and Acts chapter 15, the elders that are mentioned are made up of both the apostles and other selected elders there in the Church of Jerusalem. In fact, the apostles themselves called themselves elders in the book of Acts, and Paul refers to them as elders. Peter himself, in 1 Peter, we looked at this last week, refers to himself as an elder. John, in his epistles, refers to himself as the elder. And so, very likely that these elders are really the only position of leadership in the church. And again, we talked about that last week, how really elders, bishops, and pastors are really all different words for the same office in the church. Elders then were appointed at every church. Again, a plural number of elders were appointed in every church to look over that church. Elders were responsible to feed the flock. There again, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 1, he himself, an elder, says that they should oversee the flock as pastors, or shepherd the flock as overseers. So using all three of those terms to describe the leadership of the church. There were also elders who ruled. 1 Timothy 5, he even says, out of the elders who rule, that you should give double honor to those elders who rule well, particularly those who teach among you. And last week we talked about how that perhaps is the paid pastor as compared to the lay elders in your church, those who serve on the elder board who are not paid staff. Okay. There are many New Testament examples of this. New Testament, however, reveals no organization beyond the local church, other than the fact that elders would gather together in Jerusalem. We see the Jerusalem Council, and we see the church at Antioch sending representatives, Saul being one of them, Silas being another, Barnabas being another, sending those representatives to Jerusalem, but we don't see them answering to Jerusalem. They just go and say, hey, we as a corporate church need to make a decision here about what to do with Gentiles when they become believers. We don't see then the church at Jerusalem exercising any other authority over those local churches. That's all we have for that. In the next video, we'll talk about the congregational form of church government.